Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about what America's best at: war. Mr. Green, the United States has actually only declared war 5 times in the last 230 years. Oh, me from the past, you sniveling literalist. Well, today we're going to talk about America's first declared war, the War of 1812, so called because historians are terrible at naming things. I mean, they could have called it the Revolutionary War Part 2, or the Canadian Cataclysm, or the War to Facilitate Future Wars. But no, they just named it after the year it started. I know this disappoints the military historians among you, but as usual, we're going to spend more time talking about the causes and effects of the war than the actual, killing parts, because ultimately it's the ambiguity of the War of 1812 that makes it so interesting. The reason most often given for the War of 1812 was the British impressment of American sailors, whereby American sailors would be kidnapped and basically forced into British servitude. This disrupted American shipping. It also seems like a reasonably obvious violation of American sovereignty, but it's a little more complicated than that. First of all, there were many thousands of British sailors working aboard American ships, so many of the sailors that the British captured were in fact British. Which gets to the larger point that citizenship at the time was a pretty slippery concept, especially on the high seas. Papers were often forged, and many sailors identified their supposed Americanness through tattoos of, eagles and flags. And there were several reasons why a British sailor might want to become or pretend to be an American, including that the Brits at the time were fighting Napoleon in what historians, in their infinite creativity, called the Napoleonic Wars. And on that topic, Britain's impressment policy allowed them both to disrupt American shipping to France and to get new British sailors to strengthen their war effort, which was annoying to the Americans on a couple levels, especially the French-loving Republicans, which is a phrase that you don't hear very often anymore. Another reason often given for the war was America's crazy conspiratorial Anglophobia. There was even a widespread rumor that British agents were buying up Connecticut sheep in order to sabotage the textile industry, lest you worry that America's fascination with conspiracy theories is new. So those pushing for war were known as war hawks, and the most famous among them was Kentucky's Henry Clay. They took the impressment of sailors as an affront to American national honor, but they also complained that Britain's actions were an affront to free trade, by which they meant America's ability to trade with Europeans other than Great Britain. And to be fair, the British were trying to regulate American trade. They even passed the Orders in Council, which required American ships to dock in Britain and pay tax before trading with other European nations. Britain, we were an independent nation. You can't do that kind of stuff. We have a special relationship. It's not that special. But the problem with saying this caused the war is that the orders had been in effect for 5 years before the war started, and they were rescinded in 1812 before the U.S. declared war, although admittedly we didn't know about it because it didn't reach us until after we declared war. There was no Twitter. Another reason for the war was Canada. That's right, Canada. Americans wanted you, and who can blame them with your excellent healthcare and your hockey and your first-rate national anthem? Stan, this is fun, but enough with the hashtag 1812 problems. According to Virginia Congressman John Rudolph, agrarian cupidity, not maritime rights, urges the war. We have heard but one word: Canada. Canada. Canada! I'm not here to criticize you, John Randolph, but that's actually 3 words. Now, some historians disagree with this, but the relentless pursuit of new land certainly fits in with the Jeffersonian model of an agrarian republic. And there's another factor that figured into America's decision to go to war: expansion into territory controlled by Native Americans. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I try to guess the author of the mystery document. Usually I'm wrong and I get shocked. All right, let's see what we got here. You want, by your distinctions of Indian tribes and allotting to each a particular tract of land, to make them to war with each other. You never see an Indian come and endeavor to make the white people do so. It's Tecumseh! Drop the mic! Is something that I would do, except that the mic is actually attached to my shirt, so there's no drama in this. Clearly a Native American criticism of white people, and I happen to know that that particular one comes from Tecumseh, and I don't get shocked today! So it shouldn't come as a surprise that Americans were continuing to push westward into territory where Indians were living. I mean, this was a big reason for the Louisiana Purchase, after all. By the beginning of the war, more than 400,000 settlers had moved into territories west of the original 13 colonies, and they outnumbered American Indians by a significant margin. Some native groups responded with a measure of assimilation. Cherokees like John Ross wanted to become more civilized, that is, more white and farmery, and some of them did even adopt such civilized practices as written languages and slavery. the most civilized practice of all. People are always like, why aren't you more celebratory of American history? Well, why isn't there more to celebrate? But other Indians wanted to resist. The best known of these were the aforementioned Tecumseh and his brother Stan, can you just put on the screen? Yes, let's just enjoy looking at that. Right, that's just for all you visual learners. So he was also known as the Prophet because of his religious teachings and also because of the pronunciation issues. The Prophet encouraged Indians, especially those living in and around the settlement of Prophetstown, to abandon the ways of the whites, primarily in the form of alcohol and manufactured consumer goods. So stop drinking alcohol and eating refined sugars. This guy sounds like my doctor. Tecumseh was more militant, attempting to revive Neolon's idea of pan-Indianism and actively resisting white settlement. As he put it, sell a country, why not sell the air, the great sea, as well as the earth? Did not the Great Spirit make them all for the use of his children? The Americans responded to this reasonable criticism in the traditional manner, with guns. William Henry Harrison destroyed the native settlement at Prophetstown in what would become known as the Battle of Tippecanoe. He would later ride that fame all the way to the presidency in 1840, and then, spoiler alert, he would give the longest inauguration address ever, catch a cold, and die 40 days later. Let that be a lesson to you American politicians. Long speeches, fatal. So I've just painted a pretty negative picture of the Americans' treatment of the Indians because it was awful, but I haven't mentioned how this relates to the War of 1812. The Americans were receiving reports that the British were encouraging Tecumseh, which they probably were. And the important thing to remember here is that the War of 1812, like the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, was also a war against Indians, and as in those other two wars, the Indians were the biggest losers. And not in the cool way of the biggest loser where like Trainer Bob helps you lose weight, but in the really sad way where your entire civilization gets John C. Calhoun. So the War of 1812 was the first time that the United States declared war on anybody. It was also the smallest margin of a declaration of war vote, 79-49 in the House and 19-13 in the Senate. Northern states, which relied on trade a lot, didn't want to go to war, while southern and western states, which were more agrarian and wanted expansion to get land for farming and slavery, did. The closeness of the vote reflects a profound ambivalence about the war. As Henry Adams wrote, "Many nations have gone to war in pure gaiety of the heart, but perhaps the United States were the first to force themselves into a war they dreaded, in the hope that the war itself might create the spirit they lacked." Don't worry, Henry Adams. In the future, we're going to get pretty gaiety of heartish about war. Anyway, as an actual war, the War of 1812 was something of a farce. Let's go to the thought bubble. The U.S. Army numbered 10 to 12,000, and its officers were sunk into either sloth, ignorance, or habits of intemperate drinking. The U.S. Navy had 17 ships. Great Britain had 1,000. Also, America had very little money. Britain collected 40 times more tax revenue than the U.S. But Britain was busy fighting Napoleon, which is why they didn't really start kicking America's butt until 1814, after Napoleon was defeated. Napoleon's defeat was also the end of the practice of impressment, since Britain didn't need so many sailors anymore. Initially, much of the war consisted of America's attempts to take Canada, which any map will show you went smashingly. Americans were confident that the Canadians would rush to join the U.S. When marching from Detroit, General William Hull informed the Canadians that, quote, "You will be emancipated from tyranny and oppression and restored to the dignified station of free men." And the Canadians were like, yeah, we're okay actually. And so the British and Canada, with their Indian allies, went ahead and captured Detroit and then forced Hull's surrender. America's lack of success in Canada was primarily attributable to terrible strategy. They might have succeeded if they'd taken Montreal, but they didn't want to march through northern New York because it was full of Federalists who were opposed to the war. Instead, they concentrated on the west, that is the area around Detroit, where fighting went back and forth. The British found much more success, even seizing Washington, D.C. and burning the White House. In the course of the battle, British Admiral George Cockburn, overseeing the destruction of a newspaper printing house, told the forces that took the city, "Be sure that all the seas are destroyed so that the rascals cannot any longer abuse my name." It's hard out there for a Cockburn. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Given these problems, it's amazing there were any American successes, but there were. The battleship USS Constitution broke the myth of British naval invincibility when cannonballs bounced off it and earned it the nickname Old Ironsides. Oliver Hazard Perry defeated a British fleet in, of all places, Lake Erie. At the Battle of the Thames, William Henry Harrison defeated Tecumseh, and the Battle of Horseshoe Bend showed one of the reasons why Indians were defeated when Andrew Jackson played one group of Creeks against another group of Creeks and Cherokees. 800 Indians were killed in that battle. And speaking of Jackson, the most notable American victory of the war was the Battle of New Orleans, which catapulted him to prominence. He lost only 71 men while inflicting 2,036 British casualties. Of course, the most memorable thing about the battle was that it took place 2 weeks after the peace treaty ending the war had been signed, but hey, That's not Jackson's fault. Again, no Twitter, hashtag 1815 problems. The Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war, proved just how necessary the war had been, not at all. No territory changed hands. When negotiations started in August 1814, the British asked for northern Maine, demilitarization of the Great Lakes, and some territory to create an independent nation for the Indians in the Northwest, but none of that happened, not because the US was in a particularly good negotiating position, but because it would have been awkward for Great Britain to carve out pieces of the US and then tell Russia and Prussia that they couldn't take pieces of Europe for themselves to celebrate their victory in the Napoleonic Wars. There were no provisions in the treaty about impressment or free trade, and basically the treaty returned everything to the status quo, so neither the US nor Britain actually won, but the Indians, who suffered significant casualties and gave up even more territory, definitely lost. So with a treaty like that, the war must have had a negligible impact on American history, right? Except no, the War of 1812 confirmed that the US would exist. Britain would never invade America again until 1961. I mean, the US were good customers, and Great Britain was happy to let them trade as long as that trade wasn't helping a French dictator. The war launched Andrew Jackson's career and solidified the settlement and conquest of land east of the Mississippi River, and our lack of success in Canada reinforced Canadian nationalism while also ensuring that instead of becoming one great nation, we would forever be Canada's pants. The war also spelled the end of the Federalist Party, which tried in 1815 with the Hartford Convention to change the Constitution. In retrospect, the Hartford Convention proposals actually look pretty reasonable. They wanted to eliminate the clause wherein black people were counted as 3/5 of a human and require a 2/3 congressional majority to declare war. But because they had their convention right before Jackson's victory at New Orleans, they only came off looking unpatriotic and out of touch, as the elite so often do. It's hard to argue that Americans really won the War of 1812, but we felt like we won, and nothing unleashes national pride like war winning. The nationalistic fervor that emerged in the early 19th century was, like most things, good news for some and bad news for others. But what's important to remember, regardless of whether you're an American, is that after 1812, the United States saw itself not just as an independent nation, but as a big player on the world stage. For better and for worse, that's a gig we've held on to. And no matter how you feel about America's international interventions, you need to remember it didn't begin in Afghanistan or even Europe. It started with freaking Canada. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. The script supervisor is Meredith Danko. Our show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe. If you have questions about today's video, you can ask them in comments, where they'll be answered by our team of historians. We also accept suggestions for Libertage captions. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Goodbye. Don't forget to subscribe. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we return to one of my favorite subjects, economics.
Mr. Green, I don't want to brag, but economics is actually my best subject. Like, I got the bronze medal at the state academic decathlon tournament among C students.
Yeah, I remember me from the past. By the way, thanks for getting that picture into our show. It just goes to show you, aptitude is not destiny. Anyway, economics is about much more than like supply and demand curves. Ultimately, it's about the decisions people make and how those decisions shape their lives and the world. So today we're going to turn to one of the least studied but most interesting periods in American history, the market revolution. There weren't any fancy wars or politically charged debates, but this discussion shaped the way that most Americans actually live their lives and think about work on a daily basis. Like, if you or someone you know goes to work, well, then you have the market revolution to thank, or possibly to curse. The market revolution, like the Industrial Revolution, was more of a process than an event. It happened in the first half of the 19th century, basically the period before the Civil War. This was the so-called era of good feelings, because between 1812 and 1836, there was really only one political party, making American politics, much less contentious, also more boring. The market revolution saw many Americans move away from producing stuff largely for themselves on independent farms, that Jeffersonian ideal, and toward producing goods for sale to others, often others who were very far away, with prices set by competition with other producers. This was closer to Hamilton's American dream. In the end, buddy, you didn't get to be president, but you did win. In many ways, this was the beginning of the modern commercial industrial economy, not just in the United States, but in the world. The first thing that enabled this massive economic shift was new technology, specifically in transportation and communication. Like in the 18th century, it was very difficult to bring goods to markets, and that meant that markets were local and small. Most trade was overland, and transporting goods 30 miles overland in the United States literally cost as much as shipping them to England. So to get something from Cincinnati to New York, for instance, the most efficient way was to go down the Mississippi River, through the Gulf of Mexico, around Florida, and then up the Atlantic coast, which took 3 months. But that was still less time and less money than more direct overland routes. But new transportation changed this. First came better roads, which were largely financed by tolls. Even the federal government got in on the act, building the so-called National Road, which reached all the way from the massive city of Cumberland, Maryland, across our great nation to the equally metropolitan Wheeling, West Virginia.
Mr. Green, Mr. Green.
I know me from the past. West Virginia did not yet exist. Ah, shut up! More important than roads were canals, which made transport much cheaper and more efficient, and which wouldn't have been possible without the steamboat. Robert Fulton's steamboat Claremont first sailed from New York to Albany in 1807, demonstrating the potential of steam-powered commerce, and by 1811 there were steamboats on the Mississippi. The introduction of steamboats set off a mania for canal building. Between 1800 and the Depression of 1837, which put a halt to most construction, more than 3,000 miles of canals were built. And no state was more instrumental in the canal boom than New York, which in 1825 completed the 363-mile-long Erie Canal linking the Great Lakes with the Hudson River, which made New York the nation's premier port. Other cities like Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse grew up along the canal, so much so that Nathaniel Hawthorne once said that canal is like fertilizer, causing cities to spring up alongside it. That's such a good simile, Nathaniel Hawthorne. It's almost like the United States didn't have any good writers until Mark Twain, but we need to read somebody from the early 19th century, so I guess it's you. But from a long-term perspective, the most important new transportation? Railroads. The first commercial railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, was begun in 1828, and by 1860 there were more than 30,000 miles of rails in the United States. And on the communication side, we got the telegraph, so no longer would Andrew Jackson fight battles 2 weeks after the end of a war. Telegraphs allowed merchants to know when to expect their shipments and how much they could expect to sell them for, and then, as now, more information meant more robust markets. But perhaps the most important innovation of the time was the factory. Now, when you think of factories, you might think of like Chinese political prisoners making smartphones, but early factories looked like this. More than just a technological development, the factory was an organizational innovation. Like, factories gathered workers together in one place and split up tasks among them, making production much faster and also more efficient. The first factories relied on water power, which is the reason they were all east of the fall line, the geographic reason why there are so many waterfalls and rapids on the East Coast. But after 1840, steam power was introduced, so factories could be located in other places, especially near the large cities that were sprouting up in what we now know as the Midwest. So the American system of manufacture, which centered on mass production of interchangeable parts, grew up primarily in New England, but then it moved to the Midwest, where it spent its adolescence and its adulthood, and now its tottering decline into senility. So all these new economic features, roads, canals, railroads, telegraphs, factories, they all required massive upfront capital investment. Like, you just can't build a canal in stages as it pays for itself. So without more modern banking systems and people willing to take risks, none of this would have happened. Some of these investments were facilitated by new business organizations, especially the Limited Liability Corporation, which enabled investors to finance business ventures without being personally responsible for losses other than their own. In other words, corporations can fail without, like, ruining their stockholders and directors. People don't always like that, by the way, but it's been very good for economic growth in the last 180 years or so. So, having angered a bunch of people by talking about the important role that big businesses played in growing the American economy in the 19th century, I will now anger the rest of you by talking about the important role that the state played. In the 1830s, states began passing general incorporation laws, which made it easier to create corporations, and the Supreme Court upheld them and protected them from further interference in cases like Gibbons versus Ogden, which struck down a monopoly that New York had granted to one steamboat company, and the Charles River Bridge case, which said that building a second bridge over the Charles River did not infringe upon the charter of the first bridge. In both those cases, the court was using its power to encourage competition. And this brings up something really important about the growth of American capitalism. Government helped. The federal government built roads and canals, and its highest court protected businesses, and states issued bonds to build canals and offered sweetheart deals to companies that built railroads. And despite what we may believe about the heroic, risk-taking entrepreneurs building the American economy through solitary efforts, without the government protecting their interests, they wouldn't have been able to do much. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. The market revolution changed the landscape of work, which for most of the prior 200 years happened at home. Small-scale production of clothes and other goods had been done in the home, largely by women, and initially, this is how industrial production worked as well. Factory owners would produce some of the products, like patterns for shoes, and then farm the finishing out to people working in their houses. Eventually, they realized that it would be more efficient to gather the workers together in one place. Although the older putting out system continued in some industries, especially in big cities, after the market revolution, more and more Americans went to work instead of working from home. The market revolution also changed the way we imagined work and leisure time. Like on farms, the seasons and hours of daylight regulated the time for work, but in factories, work is regulated by the clock, which, by the way, was one of the first products to be manufactured using the American system of manufacturing. Railroads and shipping timetables further required the standardization of time. Factories also made it possible for more people to do industrial work. At first, this meant women. The workers in the early textile mills at Lowell, Massachusetts, for instance, were primarily young New England farm girls who worked for a few years in the mills before returning home to get married. Women were cheaper to employ because it was assumed that they would not be a family's sole breadwinner. At least this was the excuse for not paying them more at the time. I can't remember what excuse we have now, but I'm sure it's a great one. Anyway, all of this meant that the nature of work had changed. In colonial America, artisans worked for what they called their price, which was linked to what they produced. In a factory, however, workers were paid a wage according to the number of hours they worked, regardless of how much they produced. This may not sound like a big deal, but working for wages with one's livelihood defined by a clock and the whims of an employer was a huge change, and it undermined the idea of freedom that was supposedly the basis of America. Thomas Jefferson had worried that men working in factories dependent upon their employers were inherently unfree, and that this would make them unfit to be proper American citizens. And as it happens, many factory workers agreed with him. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So one reaction to the restrictions of the wage worker was to engage in the great American pastime of lighting out for the territories. With less and less farmland available in New England, young men had been migrating west for decades, and after the War of 1812, this flood of migration continued and even grew. Between 1790 and 1840, 4.5 million people crossed over the Appalachian Mountains, and 6 new states were created between 1815 and 1821. Ohio's population grew from 231,000 in 1810 to over 2 million by 1850. People even took up the motto, "Malaria isn't going to catch itself," and moved to Florida after we purchased it from Spain in 1819. Moving out west was a key aspect of American freedom, and the first half of the 19th century became the age of manifest destiny, the idea that it was a God-given right of Americans to spread out over the North American continent. The term was coined by a New York journalist, John L. O'Sullivan, who wrote that the people living out west, i.e. the Native Americans, must succumb to, quote, "our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment in liberty." Stan, he actually wrote overspread. One thing I love about Providence is it has like a 100% rate of give a thing unto us and take a thing away from them. One of the results of this migration was that it was really difficult for factory owners to find men who could work in their factories. First, they looked to Yankee women to fill the factories, but increasingly, those jobs were filled by immigrants. Fortunately, the U.S. had lots of immigrants, like the more than 1 million Irish people who came here fleeing poverty, especially after the potato famine of 1845 to 1851. Lastly, let's turn to the intellectual responses to the market revolution. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. If I fail to guess the author of the mystery document, I get shocked with the shock pen. And yes, this is a real shock pen. Lots of people are commenting saying I am faking the shocks. I am not faking the shocks. I am in the business of teaching you history, not in the business of faking pain. All right, let's do this thing. They do not yet see, and thousands of young men as hopeful now crowding to the barriers of the career do not yet see, that if the single man plant himself indomitably on his instincts and there abide, the huge world will come round to him. Patience. Patience with the shades of all the good and great for company, and for solace the perspectives of your own infinite life, and for work the study and the communication of principles, the making those instincts prevalent, the conversion of the world. Is it not the chief disgrace in the world not to be a unit, not to be reckoned one character, not to yield that peculiar fruit which each man was created to bear, but to be, oh God, Stan, I can't bear it anymore. It's Emerson. It's definitely Emerson. It is unreadably Emerson. Indeed, the most linguistically convoluted of the transcendentalists, which is really saying something. Anyway, I don't get punished, but I did kind of get half punished because I had to read that. The transcendentalists, like Margaret Fuller, Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, were trying to redefine freedom in a changing world. Work was increasingly regimented, factory workers were as interchangeable as the parts that they made, but the transcendentalists argued that freedom resided in an individual's power to remake oneself, and maybe even the world. But there would be a reaction to this in American literature, as it became clear that escaping drudgery to reinvent yourself was no easy task for wage workers. So the early 19th century saw a series of booms and busts, sometimes called business cycles, and with those business cycles came a growing disparity in wealth. To protect their interests, workers began forming political organizations called working man's parties that eventually morphed into unions calling for higher wages and better working conditions. And we'll have more to say about that in coming weeks, but for now it's important to remember that as America grew more prosperous, many people, women and especially slaves, but also free wage working men, recognized that the market revolution left them with much less freedom than they might have enjoyed 50 or 100 years earlier. My favorite commentary on the market revolution actually comes from the author Herman Melville in his short story Bartleby the Scrivener. Melville worked at the Customs House in New York, so he knew all about world markets firsthand. In Bartleby, he tells the story of a young clerk who works for a lawyer in New York City. Now, when you're a farmer, your work has intrinsic meaning. When you work, you have food, and when you don't work, you don't. But when you're a copyist like Bartleby, it's difficult to find meaning in what you do every day. You know that anyone else could do it, and you suspect that if your work doesn't get done, it won't actually matter very much. And in light of this, Bartleby just stops working, saying, "I prefer not," when asked, well, pretty much anything. Seeing his boss and society's reaction to someone who simply doesn't buy into the market economy is comic and then ultimately tragic, and it tells us a lot about the market revolution beyond the famous people and inventions and heroic individualism. Now, most people read Bartleby as an existentialist narrative, and it definitely is that, but for me, the story's subtitle proves that it's also about the market economy. The full title of the story is Bartleby the Scrivener, a story of Wall Street. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Mower. The script supervisor is Meredith Danko. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe. If you have questions about today's video, please ask them in comments, where they'll be answered by our team of historians. Also, suggest Libertage captions. Thanks for watching Crash Course World History. If you enjoy Crash Course, make sure you're subscribed, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. Just kidding! Thanks for watching Crash Course U.S. History, DFTBA. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about slavery, which is not funny. Yeah, so we put a lay on the eagle to try to cheer you up, but let's face it, this is going to be depressing. With slavery, every time you think like, oh, it couldn't have been that bad, it turns out to have been much worse. Mr. Green, but what about... Yeah, me from the past. I'm going to stop you right there because you're going to embarrass yourself. Slavery was hugely important to America. I mean, it led to a civil war, and it also lasted what, at least in U.S. history, counts as a long-ass time, from 1619 to 1865. And yes, I know there's a 1,200-year-old church in your neighborhood in Denmark, but we're not talking about Denmark. But slavery is most important because we still struggle with its legacy. So yes, today's episode will probably not be funny, but it will be important. So the slave-based economy in the South is sometimes characterized as having been separate from the market revolution, but that's not really the case. Without Southern cotton, the North wouldn't have been able to industrialize, at least not as quickly, because cotton textiles were one of the first industrially produced products and the most important commodity in world trade by the 19th century. And 3/4 of the world's cotton came from the American South. And speaking of cotton, why has no one mentioned to me that my collar has been half popped this entire episode, like I'm trying to recreate the Flying Nun's hat? And although there were increasingly fewer slaves in the North as Northern states outlawed slavery, cotton shipments overseas made Northern merchants rich, Northern bankers financed the purchase of land for plantations, Northern insurance companies insured slaves who were, after all, considered property and very valuable property. And in addition to turning cotton into cloth for sale overseas, Northern manufacturers sold cloth back to the South, where it was used to clothe the very slaves who had cultivated it. But certainly the most prominent effects of the slave-based economy were seen in the South. The profitability of slave-based agriculture, especially King Cotton, meant that the South would remain largely agricultural and rural. Slave states were home to a few cities, like St. Louis and Baltimore, but with the exception of New Orleans, almost all Southern urbanization took place in the Upper South, further away from the large cotton plantations. And slave-based agriculture was so profitable that it siphoned money away from other economic endeavors. Like, there was very little industry in the South. It produced only 10% of the nation's manufactured goods, and as most of the capital was being plowed into the purchase of slaves, there was very little room for technological innovation, like, for instance, railroads. This lack of industry and railroads would eventually make the South suck at the Civil War, thankfully. In short, slavery dominated the South, shaping it both economically and culturally. And slavery wasn't a minor aspect of American society. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the U.S., and in the South, they made up 1/3 of the total population. Although in the popular imagination, most plantations were these sprawling affairs with hundreds of slaves, in reality, the majority of slaveholders owned 5 or fewer slaves. And of course, most white people in the South owned no slaves at all, although if they could afford to, they would sometimes rent slaves to help with their work. These were the so-called yeoman farmers who lived self-sufficiently, raised their own food, and purchased very little in the market economy. They worked the poorest land, and as a result, were mostly pretty poor themselves. But even they largely supported slavery, partly perhaps for aspirational reasons, and partly because the racism inherent to the system gave even the poorest whites legal and social status. And Southern intellectuals worked hard to encourage these ideas of white solidarity and to make the case for slavery. Many of the founders, a bunch of whom you'll remember held slaves, saw slavery as a necessary evil. Jefferson once wrote, quote, "As it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation in the other." The belief that justice and self-preservation couldn't sit on the same side of the scale was really opposed to the American idea, and in the end, it would make the Civil War inevitable. But as slavery became more entrenched and as ideas of liberty and political equality were embraced by more people, some Southerners began to make the case that slavery wasn't just a necessary evil. They argued, for instance, that slaves benefited from slavery. Because, you know, their masters fed them and clothed them and took care of them in their old age. You still hear this argument today, astonishingly. In fact, you'll probably see asshats in the comments saying that. I will remind you, it's not cursing if you are referring to an actual ass. This paternalism allowed masters to see themselves as benevolent and to contrast their family-oriented slavery with the cold, mercenary capitalism of the free labor North. So yeah, in the face of rising criticism of slavery, some Southerners began to argue that the institution was actually good for the social order. One of the best-known proponents of this view was John C. Calhoun, who in 1837 said this in a speech on the Senate floor: "I hold that in the present state of civilization, where two races of different origin and distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual, are brought together, the relation now existing in the slaveholding states between the two is, instead of an evil, a good. A positive good." Now, of course, John C. Calhoun was a fringe politician, and nobody took his views particularly seriously.
Well, he was Secretary of State from 1844 to 1845.
Well, I mean, who really cares about the Secretary of State, Stan?
He was also Secretary of War from 1817 to 1825.
All right, but we don't even have a Secretary of War anymore.
And he was vice president from 1825 to 1832.
Oh my God, were we insane? We were, of course, but we justified the insanity with biblical passages and with the examples of the Greeks and Romans and with outright racism, arguing that black people were inherently inferior to whites and that not to keep them in slavery would upset the natural order of things, a worldview popularized millennia ago by my nemesis, Aristotle. God, I hate Aristotle. You know what defenders of Aristotle always say? He was the first person to identify dolphins. Well, okay. Dolphin identifier. Yes, that is what he should be remembered for, but he's a terrible philosopher. Here's the truth about slavery. It was coerced labor that relied upon intimidation and brutality and dehumanization. And this wasn't just a cultural system, it was a legal one. I mean, Louisiana law proclaimed that a slave owes his master a respect without bounds and an absolute obedience. The signal feature of slaves' lives was work. I mean, conditions and tasks varied, but all slaves labored usually from sunup to sundown and almost always without any pay. Most slaves worked in agriculture on plantations, and conditions were different depending on which crops were grown. Like slaves on the rice plantations of South Carolina had terrible working conditions, but they labored under the task system, which meant that once they had completed their allotted daily work, they would have time to do other things. But lest you imagine this is like how we have work and leisure time, bear in mind that they were owned and treated as property. On cotton plantation, most slaves worked in gangs, usually under the control of an overseer or another slave who was called a driver. This was back-breaking work done in the southern sun and humidity, and so it's not surprising that whippings or the threat of them were often necessary to get slaves to work. It's easy enough to talk about the brutality of slave discipline, but it can be difficult to internalize it. Like, you look at these pictures, but because you've seen them over and over again, they don't have the power they once might have. The pictures can tell a story about cruelty, but they don't necessarily communicate how arbitrary it all was, as, for example, in this story told by a woman who was a slave as a young girl. The overseer went to my father one morning and said, "Bob, I'm gonna whip you this morning." Daddy said, "I ain't done nothing." And he said, "I know it. I'm gonna whip you to keep you from doing nothing." And he hit him with that cowhide. You know, it would cut the blood out of you with every lick if they hit you hard. That brutality, the whippings, the brandings, the rape, was real, and it was intentional because in order for slavery to function, slaves had to be dehumanized. This enabled slaveholders to rationalize what they were doing, and it was hoped to reduce slaves to the animal property that is implied by the term chattel slavery. So the idea was that slaveholders wouldn't think of their slaves as human, and slaves wouldn't think of themselves as human. But it didn't work. Let's go to the thought bubble. Slaves' resistance to their dehumanization took many forms, but the primary way was by forming families. Family was a refuge for slaves and a source of dignity that masters recognized and sought to stifle. A paternalistic slave owner named Bennett H. Barrow wrote in his Rules for the Highland Plantation, "No rule that I have stated is of more importance than that relating to Negroes marrying outside of the plantation. It creates a feeling of independence." Most slaves did marry, usually for life, and when possible, slaves grew up in two-parent households. Single-parent households were common, though, as a result of one parent being sold. In the Upper South, where the economy was shifting from tobacco to different, less labor-intensive cash crops, the sale of slaves was common. Perhaps 1/3 of slave marriages in states like Virginia were broken up by sale. Religion was also an important part of life in slavery. While masters wanted their slaves to learn the parts of the Bible that talked about being happy in bondage, slave worship tended to focus on the stories of Exodus, where Moses brought the slaves out of bondage, or biblical heroes who overcame great odds like Daniel and David. And although most slaves were forbidden to learn to read and write, many did anyway, and some became preachers. Slave preachers were often very charismatic leaders, and they roused the suspicion of slave owners, and not without reason. Two of the most important slave uprisings in the South were led by preachers. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? We're doing 2 set pieces in a row? All right. The rules here are simple. I wanted to reshoot that, but Stan said no. I guess the author of the mystery document. If I am wrong, I get shocked with the shock pen. Since I have been in the Queen's dominions, I have been well contented. Yes, well contented for sure. Man is as God intended he should be. That is, all are born free and equal. This is a wholesome law, not like the Southern laws, which puts man made in the image of God on level with brutes. Oh, what will become of the people, and where will they stand in the day of judgment? Would that the 5th verse of the 3rd chapter of Malachi were written as with a bar of iron and the point of a diamond upon every oppressor's heart, that they might repent of this evil and let the oppressed go free. All right, it's definitely a preacher, because only preachers have read Malachi. Probably African American, probably not someone from the South. I'm going to guess that it is Richard Allen, the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Ah, dang it! It's Joseph Taper, and Stan just pointed out to me that I should have known it was Joseph Taper because it starts out, "Since I have been in the Queen's dominions." He was in Canada. He escaped slavery to Canada, the Queen's dominions. All right, Canadians, I blame you for this, although thank you for abolishing slavery decades before we did. Ah! So the mystery document shows one of the primary ways that slaves resisted their oppression, by running away. Although some slaves, like Joseph Taper, escaped slavery for good by running away to northern free states or even to Canada, where they wouldn't have to worry about fugitive slave laws, even more slaves ran away temporarily, hiding out in the woods or the swamps and eventually returning. No one knows exactly how many slaves escaped to freedom, but the best estimate is that 1,000 or so a year made the journey northward. Most fugitive slaves were young men, but the most famous runaway has been hanging out behind me all day long, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman escaped to Philadelphia at the age of 29, and over the course of her life, she made about 20 trips back to Maryland to help friends and relatives make the journey north on the Underground Railroad. But a more dramatic form of resistance to slavery was actual armed rebellion, which was attempted. Now, individuals sometimes took matters into their own hands and beat or even killed their white overseers overseers or masters, like Bob, the guy who received the arbitrary beating, responded to it by killing his overseer with a hoe. But that said, large-scale slave uprisings were relatively rare. The four most famous ones all took place in a 35-year period at the beginning of the 19th century. Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800, which we talked about before, was discovered before he was able to carry out his plot. Then in 1811, a group of slaves upriver from New Orleans seized cane knives and guns and marched on the city before militia stopped them. And in 1822, Denmark Vesey, a former slave who had purchased his freedom, may have organized a plot to destroy Charleston, South Carolina. I say may have because the evidence against him is disputed and comes from a trial that was not fair. But regardless, the end result of that trial is that he was executed, as were 34 slaves. But the most successful slave rebellion, at least in the sense that they actually killed some people, was Nat Turner's in August 1831. Turner was a preacher, and with a group of about 80 slaves, he marched from farm to farm in Southampton County, Virginia, killing the inhabitants, most of whom were women and children because the men were attending a religious revival meeting in North Carolina. Turner and 17 other rebels were captured and executed, but not before they struck terror into the hearts of whites all across the American South. Virginia's response was to make slavery worse, passing even harsher laws that forbade slaves from preaching and prohibited teaching them to read. Other slave states followed Virginia's lead, and by the 1830s, slavery had grown, if anything, more harsh. So this shows that large-scale armed resistance was, Django Unchained aside, not just suicidal, but also a threat to loved ones and really to all slaves. But it is hugely important to emphasize that slaves did resist their oppression. Sometimes this meant taking up arms, but usually it meant more subtle forms of resistance, like intentional work slowdowns or sabotaging equipment or pretending not to understand instructions. And most importantly, in the face of systematic legal and cultural degradation, they reaffirmed their humanity through family and through faith. Why is this so important? Because too often in America, we still talk about slaves as if they failed to rise up, when in fact, rising up would not have made life better for them or for their families. The truth is, sometimes carving out an identity as a human being in a social order that is constantly seeking to dehumanize you is the most powerful form of resistance. Refusing to become the chattel that their masters believed them to be is what made slavery untenable and the Civil War inevitable. So make no mistake, slaves fought back, and in the end, they won. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. The script supervisor is Meredith Danko. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe. Every week there's a new caption to the Libertage, but today's episode was so sad that we couldn't fit a Libertage in until now. Suggest Libertage captions in comments, where you can also ask questions about today's video that will be answered by our team of historians. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be abolitionist. Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today, after last week's bummer on slavery, we turn to a happier topic, the rise of democratization in the U.S. This was also known as the Age of Jackson. No, Stan, not that Jackson. No, Stan, come on, seriously. No. Yes, that Jackson, Andrew Jackson. Sorry, I just had to check my collar. Right, so you'll recall that the initial democracy of the United States wasn't terribly democratic. Almost all voters were white male landowners.
Mr. Green, that's just radically unfair.
Exactly, me from the past, but between 1820 and 1850, this started to change. State legislatures lowered or else eliminated the property qualifications for voting, which allowed many more people to vote so long as they were, both white and male.
Mr. Green!
So I'd be in, right? Yeah, that seems reasonable. Yeah, me from the past. Quick privilege check. One of the reasons we study history is so that you can learn that people like you are not actually at the center of history, even though, you've been taught that. But anyway, the whole idea of owning land as a prerequisite for voting is sort of Jeffersonian. An individual who works his own land can be truly independent because he doesn't need to rely upon markets to acquire stuff or, God forbid, wages to give him money with which to buy stuff. No, he makes his own stuff, and he doesn't need anybody except for slaves and also women to make shoes and clothes and to cook food and also make children. But in light of the market revolution, the idea of excluding wage workers seemed very outdated. The idea of excluding women and non-white people, though, still quite popular. popular. But this defining characteristic of the age of Jackson really had very little to do with Andrew Jackson himself, because by the time he became president in 1829, every state except for North Carolina, Virginia, and Rhode Island had already gotten rid of their property requirements. In fact, that's probably why he got elected. Right, so you recall that America's mostly fake victory in the War of 1812 and the subsequent collapse of the Federalist Party ushered in the era of good feelings, which was another way of saying that there was basic agreement on most domestic policies. The American system was a program of economic nationalism built on, 1, federally financed internal improvements like roads and canals, what we would now call infrastructure, 2, tariffs to protect new factories and industries, and 3, a national bank that would replace the first Bank of the United States, whose charter expired in 1811. You'll never guess what we called this second bank, unless you guess that we called it the Second Bank of the United States. The main supporters of this American system were our old friend John C. Calhoun and our new friend Henry Clay. Both were Jeffersonian Republicans, which isn't surprising because that was the only political party, but it's kind of surprising because the American system had nothing to do with the agrarian republic that Jefferson had championed. But whatever, this was the era of good feelings, so we're gonna go with it. By the way, this nationalism also extended to foreign affairs. After Latin America won its independence from Spain, President Monroe made a speech proposing that Europe shouldn't try to retake colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And if they did, we would, do stuff. This so-called Monroe Doctrine also said that the U.S. would stay out of European wars. Ha 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 ha, that is hilarious! But we did live up to the other end of it. You'll remember that when the British came for the Falkland Islands, we were like, this shall not stand! Just kidding, we were like, go ahead. Right, so the last era of good feelings president was John Quincy Adams, who was quite the diplomat and expansionist. He actually wrote the Monroe Doctrine, for instance. But in fact, it turns out that all feelings were not good. There was significant disagreement over 3 main issues. First, many people felt that the federal government shouldn't invest in infrastructure. Like James Madison, who'd initially supported those bills, ended up vetoing one of them that included a big spending increase to finance roads and canals. Now, the roads and canals did get built, but in the end, most of the financing fell to the states. There were also big problems with the Second Bank of the United States, which, is why you cannot visit a branch of it these days, but we'll get to that in a minute. And lastly, there was the perennial issue of slavery. In this case, the problem started, as so many problems do, in Missouri. So in 1819, Missouri had enough people in it to become a state, but despite the fact that there were already more than 10,000 slaves there, a New York congressman named James Tallmadge made a motion to prohibit the introduction of further slaves into the proposed state. It took almost 2 years to work out the John C. Calhoun storm that blew up after this. Actually, it took more than that. It took until the end of the Civil War, basically. But in the short run, Missouri was allowed to enter the Union as a slave state, while Maine was carved out of Massachusetts to keep the balance of things. But the Missouri Compromise also said that no state admitted above the 3630 line of latitude would be allowed to have slaves, except, of course, for Missouri itself, which, as you can see, is well above the line. Anyway, this solution to westward expansion worked out magnificently, provided that you enjoy civil wars. So Thomas Jefferson, who, by the way, was still alive, which gives you some context for how young the nation truly was, wrote that the Missouri Compromise was, quote, like a fire bell in the night that awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once the death knell of the Union. Eventually, almost, but in the short term, it did mean the rise of political parties. So America was becoming more democratic, but if there was only one political party, that democratic spirit had nowhere to go. Fortunately, there was a tiny little magician named Martin Van Buren. They really did call him the Little Magician, by the way, also the Red Fox of Kinderhook, but we remember him as the worst-haired president. So despite having been president of the United States, Van Buren is arguably more important for having invented the Democratic Party. He was first to realize that national political parties could be a good thing. So I mentioned that Martin Van Buren was known as the Little Magician, and I know this sounds a little bit silly, but I think it's telling. You see, Van Buren was only the second American president with a well-used nickname, and the first was his immediate predecessor, Andrew Jackson, or Old Hickory. Why does this matter? Well, when you're actually having to campaign for office, as all presidential candidates did after the election of 1828, and you're trying to appeal to the newly enfranchised common man, what better way to seem like a regular guy than to have a nickname? I mean, if you think this is crazy, just think of the nicknames of some of our most popular presidents. Honest Abe, the Bull Moose, the Gipper. Even our lesser-known presidents had nicknames. Young Hickory, Handsome Frank, Old Rough and Ready, Big Steve, James Buchanan, and I am not making this up, was Old Public Functionary. Who are you gonna vote for? Oh, I think the Old Public Functionary. He seems competent. As it happens, He wasn't. So by now you're probably wondering, where does Andrew Jackson fit into all of this? When we last caught up with Jackson, he was winning the Battle of New Orleans shortly after the end of the War of 1812. He continued his bellicose ways, fighting Indians in Florida, although he was not actually authorized to do so, and became so popular from all of his Indian killing that he decided to run for president in 1824. The election of 1824 was very close, and it went to the House, where John Quincy Adams was eventually declared the winner, and Jackson denounced this as a corrupt bargain. So in 1828, Jackson ran a much more negative campaign. One of his campaign slogans was "Vote for Andrew Jackson, who can fight, not John Quincy Adams, who can write." Adams' supporters responded by arguing that having a literate president wasn't such a bad thing, and also by accusing Jackson of being a murderer, which, given his frequent habit of dueling and massacring, he sort of was. So as you can see, the quality of discourse in American political campaigns has come a long way. Anyway, Jackson won. Jackson ran as the champion of the common man, and in a way he was. I mean, he had little formal schooling, and in some ways he was the archetypal self-made man. Jackson's policies defined the new Democratic Party, which had formerly been known as the Jeffersonian Democratic Republican. So who were these new Democrats? Well, generally they tended to be lower to middle class men, usually farmers, who were suspicious of the widening gap between the rich and the poor that was one of the results of the market revolution. And they were particularly worried about bankers, merchants, and speculators, who seemed to be getting rich without actually producing anything. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar. This vision probably would have carried the day, except a new party arose in response to Jackson's election: the Whigs. No, Stan, the Whigs. Yes. The American Whigs took their name from the English Whigs, who were opposed to absolute monarchy. And the American Whigs felt that Andrew Jackson was grabbing so much power for the executive branch that he was turning himself into King Andrew. So the Whigs were big supporters of the American system and its active federal government. You know, tariffs, infrastructure, etc. Their greatest support was in the Northeast, especially from businessmen and bankers who benefited from those tariffs and the stability provided by a national bank. And they also thought the government should promote moral character, because that was necessary for a person to act as a truly independent citizen. So Jackson's policies must have been pretty egregious for them to spawn an entirely new political party. What did he actually do as president? Well, let's go to the thought bubble. Let's start with nullification. So in 1828, Congress passed the Tariff of 1828 because they were not yet in the habit of marketing their bills via naming them with funny acronyms. Jackson supported this in spite of the fact that it benefited manufacturers. The tariff raised prices on imported manufactured goods made of wool and iron, which enraged South Carolina because they'd put all their money into slavery and none into industry. So unlike Northerners, who could avoid the higher prices by manufacturing sweaters and pants and such at home, South Carolinians would have to pay more. They were so angry at this tariff of abominations that the South Carolina legislature threatened to nullify it. Jackson didn't take kindly to this affront to federal power, but South Carolina persisted, and when Congress passed a new tariff in 1832, one that actually lowered the duties, the Palmetto State's government nullified it. Jackson responded by getting Congress to pass the Force Act, which authorized him to use the Army and Navy to collect taxes. A full-blown crisis was averted when Congress passed a new tariff in 1833 and South Carolina relented. This smelled a bit of dictatorship, armed tax collectors and all, and helped to cement Jackson's reputation as a tyrant, at least among the Whigs. And then we have the Native Americans. Much of Jackson's reputation there was based on killing them, so it's no surprise that he supported Southern states' efforts to appropriate Indian lands and make the Indians move. This support was formalized in the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which Jackson supported. The law provided funds to relocate Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creek, and Seminole Indians from their homes in Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, and Alabama. In response, these tribes adopted a novel approach and sued the government. And then the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia's actions in removing the Cherokees violated their treaties with the federal government and that they had a right to their land. To which Jackson supposedly responded by saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." So Jackson set the stage for the forced removal of the Cherokees from Georgia to Oklahoma, but it actually took place in the winter of 1838-1839 under Jackson's successor, Van Buren. At least 1/4 of the 18,000 Indians died on the forced march that came to be known as the Trail of Tears. Boy, Thought Bubble, you do know how to end on a downer, but thank you. But Andrew Jackson also changed our banking system. Just as today, banks were very important to the industrial and mercantile development of the U.S. And at the beginning of Jackson's presidency, American banking was dominated by the Second National Bank, which you'll remember had been established by Congress as part of the American system. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. When I inevitably fail to guess the author of the mystery document, I get shocked with the shock pen. The powers, privileges, and favors bestowed upon it in the original charter by increasing the value of the stock far above its par value operated as a gratuity of many millions to its stockholders. Every monopoly and all exclusive privileges are granted at the expense of the public, which ought to receive a fair equivalent. The many millions which this act proposes to bestow on the stockholders of the existing bank must come directly or indirectly out of the earnings of the American people. Stan, I know this one. It is not conceivable how the present stockholders can have any claim to the special favor of government. Should the bank's influence become concentrated, as it may under the operation of such an act as this, in the hands of a self-elected directory, will there not be cause to tremble for the purity of our elections? It is Andrew Jackson's veto of the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. Yes! So in 1832, bank leader Nicholas Biddle persuaded Congress to pass a bill extending the life of the second U.S. bank for 20 years. Jackson thought that the bank would use its money to oppose his re-election in 1836, so he vetoed that bill. In fact, the reason I knew that was from the veto message is because it talks about the bank as an instrument to subvert democracy. Jackson set himself up as a defender of the lower classes by vetoing the bank's charter. Now, Whigs took exception to the idea that the president was somehow a more democratic representative of the people than the legislature, but in the end, Jackson's view won out. He used the veto power more than any prior president, turning it into a powerful tool of policy, which it remains to this day, by the way. So the Second Bank of the U.S. expired in 1836, which meant that suddenly we had no central institution with which to control federal funds. Jackson ordered that money should be dispersed into local banks, unsurprisingly preferencing ones that were friendly to him. These so-called pet banks were another version of rewarding political supporters that Jackson liked to call rotation in office. Opponents called this tactic of awarding government offices to political favorites the spoils system. Anyway, these smaller banks proceeded to print more and more paper money because, you know, free money. Like between 1833 and 1837, the face value of banknotes in circulation rose from $10 million to $149 million, and that meant inflation. Initially, states loved all this new money that they could use to finance internal improvements, but inflation is really bad for wage workers and also eventually everyone. So all this out-of-control inflation, coupled with rampant land speculation, eventually led to an economic collapse, the Panic of 1837. The subsequent depression lasted until 1843, and Jackson's bank policy proved to be arguably the most disastrous fiscal policy in American history, which is really saying something. It also had a major effect on American politics because business-oriented Democrats became Whigs and the remaining Democrats further aligned with agrarian interests, which meant slavery. So the age of Jackson was more democratic than anything that came before, and it gave us the beginnings of modern American politics. I mean, Jackson was the first president to really expand executive power and to argue that the president is the most important democratically elected official in the country. One of the things that makes Andrew Jackson's presidency so interesting and also so problematic is that he was elected via a more democratic process, but he concentrated more power in the executive in a thoroughly undemocratic way. In the end, Andrew Jackson probably was the worst American president to end up on currency, particularly given his disastrous fiscal policies. But the age of Jackson is still important. And it's worth remembering that all that stuff in American politics started out with the expansion of democracy. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Miller. The script supervisor is Meredith Danko. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe. If you have Libertage caption suggestions, please leave them in comments, where you can also leave questions about today's video that will be answered by our team of historians. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome. What?
On December 2nd, 1823, U.S. President James Monroe was giving his annual State of the Union address to Congress when he threw in a couple of remarks about the United States' relationship with the powers of Europe. He said, "The American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. In the wars of the European powers in matters relating to themselves, we have never taken any part, nor does it comport with our policy to do so. We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. So basically, in one fell swoop, James Monroe told the crowned heads of Europe to stay out of the Americas. He said, "As far as I'm concerned, the era of colonization is over. So stop giving us the side eye. Stop looking at your maps and trying to decide where you might place a little colony next. No more European colonization in the Americas. What's more, don't interfere." The Americas are the United States' concern, so we don't want the powers of Europe to meddle in any of the affairs of Latin America or South America. You can keep your system, and by system, Monroe meant monarchy, out of the Americas. This is the hemisphere of democracy. So this is an incredibly bold statement. Let's not forget here that the United States is not exactly a world power in 1823. They could at best be said to be a minor power even in the Americas. The United States is not a major world military power. It's not a major world navy power. And let's remember that in this era, having a strong navy was tantamount to being able to take over the world. They're kind of a second-rate nation in a second-rate part of the world. So what was the response when the United States made this incredibly bold assertion that they would not permit any more colonization or interference in the Americas from Europe? Crickets. Nobody really cared. To the established powers of Europe, the United States was no more than a little mosquito, buzzing around, maybe making a lot of noise, a bit annoying, but pretty easy to swat. No matter how much noise the United States made, the only thing that mattered to the great powers of the world was whether or not the United States could enforce the Monroe Doctrine, which with such a weak military presence, they certainly could not. Nevertheless, the Monroe Doctrine became a key facet of American foreign policy throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. It became a justification for manifest destiny, and would play a major role in the foreign policies of Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So where did the Monroe Doctrine come from? Well, let's take a minute to look at some of the major world events at the time period and the major players who brought the Monroe Doctrine about. All right, dateline 1820. It has been a bad couple of years for monarchy in Europe. For one thing, the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution have been convulsing the powers of Europe for several years. By 1815, the revolution has more or less finished and the monarchies of Europe have been reinstated. But this revolutionary fervor coming from the French Revolution, coming also from the American Revolution, has started to spread. And so movements for independence are now taking hold in South America. There's a Chilean movement for independence, Argentinian movement for independence, Venezuelan movement for independence. So they've kind of caught the democracy bug. And the people in the United States are cheering for their Southern brethren, saying, "Excellent work picking up democracy, breaking away from old-fashioned, monarchical, tyrannical Europe. We're totally on your side." But it's easier to make an independence movement happen when the home country is distracted with another war, aka the Napoleonic Wars. And once the Napoleonic Wars are over, the monarchies of Europe start saying, you know what? Since Spain is in control of these nations, now Spain has the time and energy to consider maybe putting down these revolutions. So they're no longer distracted by war, and they have the manpower and the bandwidth to think about maybe trying to reinstate or secure Spanish rule in South America, where nations have been in the process of revolution. Now, we don't know the extent to which Spain was actually planning on putting these revolutions down, but we do know that the United States and England were very concerned that the monarchies of the continent, France and Spain, might join together and try to put down all of these revolutions. Now, why wouldn't they want that? Well, for the most part, it kind of came down to markets. Now, if you think back to early American colonial society, the economic system was known as mercantilism. And mercantilism is the practice of colonies kind of existing to enrich the mother country. So all trade goes through the home country. And that means that the home country is going to be making sure that the colonies are not trading with any other international partners, because they want to be the ones who are enriched by the natural resources of the colonies. So when Chile and Argentina and Venezuela revolt from Spain, it means that their markets are now opened up to the United States and to England. And so England and the United States are not eager to see these new nations be returned to their colonial status, because thanks to mercantilism, they're not going to be able to trade with them anymore. So with this idea in mind, the British Foreign Secretary, a man named George Canning, approached the American Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, and he said, why don't we make a joint proclamation between the United States and Great Britain saying that the powers of Europe should not interfere in the New World? And John Quincy Adams thought, I'm not sure if I like you British folks. Remember that the War of 1812 had not taken place too long beforehand. The United States was not quite ready to be friends with the United Kingdom yet, and they were a little bit afraid that if the United States made a joint declaration with England, that it would seem a little bit like a flea on the back of a Rottweiler saying, "Don't mess with us or we'll bite you," right? The United States didn't have nearly the strength to actually make an equal partnership, so it might have looked a little bit like they were hiding behind the British in a joint declaration. But JQA thought this actually still sounded like a pretty good plan, so he floated the idea to President James Monroe. Now, there's kind of a movement of nationalism going on at this time in the United States. So even though the United States didn't technically win the War of 1812, they kind of felt like they had. And so they're busy kind of creating a new nationalist rhetoric in the United States. They're feeling pretty good about themselves. You know, they stood up to their old foe of Great Britain and won, or at the very least didn't lose. But to them it was kind of the same thing. So John Quincy Adams crafts for James Monroe what will become known as the Monroe Doctrine. Now, Monroe is not only concerned about the possibility of European powers coming down here and trying to start fights with each other over the fate of South America. Monroe was also worried about Russia, who had recently made some territorial claims in Canada, saying that their territory should come all the way down there. And the Russians had started putting some forts on the coast of California, close to modern-day San Francisco. So Monroe sees the old monarchical powers of Europe sort of encroaching both from the north and the south here. And so, in 1823, he makes the announcement of the Monroe Doctrine. He says, no more colonization. Russia, get out of there. and no more interference in general. So don't try to turn these new republics back into colonies under the rule of monarchies. In fact, just keep your monarchy out of our hemisphere altogether. So Monroe makes this statement completely outside of the relationship with the United Kingdom. So it doesn't have this kind of riding on the coattails feeling of being allied with Britain. But nevertheless, the only way that the United States can actually count on the Monroe Doctrine being enforced is because the British Navy is so incredibly powerful. Right? I'm going to draw a very bad boat here. But nobody who heard about the Monroe Doctrine thought, oh man, we better not make the United States angry. What they thought was, oh man, we better not make the British Empire angry. Because they knew that the British Navy, which wanted neutrality of the seas, which wanted to be able to continue to have these trade relationships with new nations in South America, would defend the neutrality and the independence of South America by proxy, and by doing so kind of enforce the Monroe Doctrine. So this is interesting. You could think of this as being a little bit weaselly on the part of Monroe, declaring that the Americas should remain free of the influence of Europe, but counting on the United Kingdom to enforce it. Or you could think of it as perhaps a brilliant policy maneuver. I don't know. Certainly, the nations of South America and Latin America appreciated this declaration of independence for the Americas coming from the United States, but they certainly knew that it was more about the United States making sure that they themselves were protected than wanting to have a real equal partnership with South America. So the Monroe Doctrine really didn't amount to much for most of the 19th century. It was certainly a justification as the United States continued to push west in their quest of manifest destiny, but it will become increasingly important in the 20th century as the United States steps onto the world stage with things like the Spanish-American War under the auspices of William McKinley and making famous Theodore Roosevelt, saying that the Caribbean is the province of the United States, and the nations of Latin America and South America, they're only to be dealt with through the United States. So you can see the Monroe Doctrine as a very early expression of the United States' intention to become a world power and to be the leading and most powerful nation in the Americas. And you can also see it as an expression of American isolationism, which will really be the leading aspect of American foreign policy up until the Spanish-American War. As early as George Washington's farewell address, Washington expressed the view that the United States should just not get involved in the business of Europe, that would only lead to heartbreak. While the Monroe Doctrine is now kind of taking not only that idea that the United States should not become involved in the affairs of Europe, but also turning it around and saying that Europe should not become involved in the affairs of the Americas, drawing an even stronger barrier between the old world and the new.
So some historians have actually said that the market revolution is more revolutionary than the American Revolution. Actually, this is a very classic AP U.S. history question. Which was more revolutionary, the American Revolution or the market revolution? But how could something actually be more revolutionary than the American Revolution? Well, it's because the market revolution was a confluence of inventions, changes in the way that the American people did business, and changes in the way that people got goods to market that happened in this period from about 1790 to 1850. So this is kind of a large period of history, and I don't think it's really important for you to have a laundry list of dates of exactly when what thing was invented, but just kind of take in the idea that in the first half or so of the early 19th century, There were many new inventions in both factory work and in transportation and communication, and that how people did business changed a lot. So I want to take some time to look into all three of these revolutions: the Industrial Revolution, the revolution in transportation and communication, and just the broader market revolution. So I know this is a subset of itself, but I'll get to that. And in this video, I want to start out by talking about the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so what was the Industrial Revolution? This was, broadly speaking, a revolution in the kinds of machinery that people used to make finished goods. Now, if you think about the early republic in the United States, you often think of kind of an agrarian society. And that was how Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, really imagined the United States as a nation of small farmers. But Thomas Jefferson didn't necessarily see all of these revolutions in industry coming. He couldn't anticipate that. And so in the 1790s, early 1800s, a bunch of new inventions came to the United States that completely revolutionized how things were made. So in this time period, the United States kind of slowly begins its transformation from being a nation of farmers to a nation of people who worked for wages by the hour and then used the money that they made from that hourly labor to buy the things that they need. So how did this happen? One event that historians often point to is the introduction of the textile mill to the United States. So this fellow here was named Samuel Slater. And Samuel Slater was an Englishman who worked in a textile mill. And remember that the United Kingdom was the world's capital of textile production in this time. And they were so jealous of their position as the world's leading textile producer that they even made it illegal to export the plans for a textile mill. Samuel Slater decided that even if it was illegal to export actual plans, it wasn't necessarily illegal to export his brain. So he decided to memorize how these textile looms worked, and this is powered by a water wheel. And then he actually got in disguise, put himself on a ship, and came to Rhode Island to set up a textile mill. In fact, people were so angry that he did this that in his hometown he's actually known as Slater the Traitor. So what was new about this? Well, I think the water wheel aspect is really one of the key innovations here. So instead of being powered by humans or perhaps being powered by animals, now American machinery can be powered by an outside source, so water or steam. And that means that these mills and factories later are going to kind of congregate around sources of power like rivers, for example. So if you've ever wondered why so many American cities are next to rivers, it's usually because they needed them to power mills. So starting in the 1790s and really into the early 19th century, there's this slow transformation toward factory labor. And you can see in this image here that a lot of the people actually laboring in these factories were women because, young men kind of had a pretty good path forward in life at this time period. They could be farmers like their fathers. Maybe they could learn a trade. But for young women, there wasn't necessarily a form of income outside the house. And so a man named Charles Lowell decided to set up a whole series of textile mills in what will be called Lowell, Massachusetts. It's just outside of Boston. And he primarily employed young women to work in these textile mills. I think partly because young women were associated with working with fabric. Women frequently did the spinning and the sewing in the household, but also because young women, you could probably pay a little bit less than young men for the same kind of labor. So this is kind of a very slow revolution toward individual work, right? Because as a nation of farmers, most people would have worked in a family unit. And even some of the very earliest factories in the United States would hire family units. That was known as the Rhode Island system. By this time, by Lowell's Mills, he started hiring individual workers for individual wages. And the working conditions were pretty brutal. You know, most women at the Lowell Mills worked 12-hour days with no air conditioning. Remember, this is long before there's air conditioning, for pretty low wages. I'd say probably about $3 a week. But despite the pretty harsh conditions, for many of them, this was a really good opportunity because this is the first time in their lives they'd ever had any chance to make money of their own, to be away from their families. It's kind of expected that if you were a young woman in Massachusetts, you wanted to go work in the Lowell Mills, you could go there for a few years of your life, make a little bit of money, and then go back to your hometown, meet someone, get married, start a family of your own. So it kind of makes work for women outside the home respectable. And textile production is going to continue to ramp up in the United States. In the late 1840s, a man named Elias Howe invents a really excellent sewing machine. Now, he's not the first man ever to invent a sewing machine. There were versions of them stretching back to, I think, even the 1750s. But Howe's sewing machine brought together a lot of different capacities that made it kind of the best sewing machine. And it will be even further refined by Isaac Singer, who we associate today with the Singer sewing machine. And so these massive textile mills really become the backbone of New England commerce. But they never would have gotten started without another invention, which was the cotton gin. And the cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney in 1793. And what's important about the cotton gin? So here's the gin. And basically, it's kind of a box with some spikes on it that allows you to take these balls of cotton and separate them from the seeds. And separating cotton from the seeds was an extremely labor-intensive process. If you've never held a ball of cotton, it's extremely sticky. So you kind of have to wade through the little bits of cotton, pull out these seeds. It takes forever. And so an average day's work would not produce all that much cotton that was ready for market. Well, Whitney completely revolutionizes this with the cotton gin. These little spikes help separate the cotton seeds from the cotton ball and revolutionizes how much cotton can be produced by a single person in a single day. Whitney's cotton gin made it possible for a single person to process 50 pounds of cotton in a single day, which is just an order of magnitude more than they were able to do beforehand. But this is really interesting because it had kind of a massive human cost in the form of really bolstering the institution of slavery in the American South. Because when farming cotton was so labor intensive, it really wasn't very profitable. And so the institution of slavery was actually starting to die out a little bit. Before the 1790s, people were saying, I don't know if it's actually worth it to keep slaves. So if it weren't for the cotton gin, the United States might actually have outlawed slavery considerably earlier than it ended up doing in the 1860s. So it's interesting to note that even though these inventions really changed the fabric of American society, allowed some people to earn money who'd never been able to earn money before, it also meant that the institution of slavery was really entrenched in the United States and would only continue to expand until the 1860s. So that's a little bit of a peek into the human cost of the Industrial Revolution, and we'll get more into what some of those costs were and what some of the benefits were in the next video. So we've been talking about the market revolution in the United States, which was this period in the first half of the 19th century where the way that Americans did business really changed. And it changed in a number of ways. So the kinds of work that people did changed. And the people they sold their goods to changed in the form of new markets. And even the kinds of commodities that they were producing. All of these were altered in the first half of the 19th century thanks to a couple of simultaneous trends. The Industrial Revolution, in which new technologies were developed to make production more efficient, and revolutions in transportation and communication, which made it easier to get goods and people to far distances more quickly and to communicate over considerable distances more quickly. And these really resulted in a reorganization of American society that some historians have actually said was more revolutionary than the American Revolution. So in the last video, we discussed some of the new technologies which changed American work in the early 19th century. One of these was the introduction of the textile mill, which was powered by a water wheel by Samuel Slater, which helped textile mills become the chief industry of New England. Also helped women start working outside the home in the Lowell Mills, started by Charles Lowell, and also began the system by which factory owners would hire individuals rather than family units to work for wages in their factories. The other major invention that had a really important impact on American society was the cotton gin, which was a machine that separated cotton seeds from the fiber, and it made the production of cotton considerably more profitable. And so with cotton a profitable crop, the American South really invested in cotton, and investing in cotton as its main cash crop meant they really entrenched the system of slavery. So even though in the 1780s, early 1790s, many southern states were thinking perhaps they'd abolish slavery because the institution was not overly profitable, as cotton became the cash crop of the South, the institution of slavery would be entrenched and continue to grow until the 1860s. So those are some of the new technologies of production. In this video, I want to spend some time talking about the revolution in communication and transportation that happened also in this time period. So just like inventions like the textile mill or the cotton gin made it easier to work faster, inventions in transportation and communication in the early 19th century also made it possible to transport goods faster and to transport information faster. So I want to talk about just a few of these transportation inventions. One of these was the railroad. Now, the railroad was not invented in the United States. Rather, the United States imported the railroad technology from England and Germany. And this is one of the very first railroads in the United States. I think it's kind of adorable because you can see how it still is really owing a debt stylistically to a wagon, even looks like a wagon here on the end. So railroads begin to come into the United States in the early 1800s. And first, they're mostly for cargo or helping to move stone, things to help build canals, which we'll get to in a second. But soon, they're also passenger rail stations. And the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, or B&O Railroad, which you may know from your Monopoly board, was one of the first passenger rail lines in the United States. Another major transportation revolution of this time period was shipping on water. So in 1807, inventor Robert Fulton came up with the steamship. And so a steamship, and you can see the little smokestacks right here, makes it much easier to power the ship. And one thing you can do then is go against the tide of a river. So instead of just, for example, going down the Mississippi River to the port of New Orleans, you can also go back up the Mississippi River, which means commerce can go more easily in both directions. Another major innovation of the time period are canals. And this here is a map of the Erie Canal, which was completed in 1825. And a canal is a relatively narrow, relatively shallow waterway, but it still allows cargo barges to move across what otherwise would be really hard to navigate territory. So, it's hard to see here, but there are mountains here, right? So now you can take cargo across mountains, across large stretches of land by ship, which is much faster than trying to do it on foot or with a wagon. I think it's actually hard for us to imagine now, but in the early 19th century, and really for most of time before then, waterways were the highways of the world. It was a lot easier to get from Boston to London across the Atlantic by ship than it would have been to get from Boston to the Appalachian Mountains on foot. Before the invention of air travel, before the interstate highway system, and really up until the invention of the railroad, waterways were the easiest way to get around in the world. And the last communication revolution that I want to talk about is the invention of the telegraph, which a portrait painter turned inventor named Samuel Morse first patented in 1844. And Morse invented Morse code because the telegraph worked by sending pulses down copper wires, so it made it easy to communicate through coded messages of dots and dashes. So dots and dashes corresponded with letters, which allowed you to send messages over extremely long distances. So you could send a message by telegraph in an instant, as opposed to sending a letter, which might take days or even weeks to get to its destination. So all these revolutions in transportation and communication kind of translate into two major transformations in American business at this time period. One is that the scope of business that you can do is much greater, because now if you're a farmer who lives in, say, Rochester, your radius of people you can sell your produce to before it goes bad is considerably larger now. Instead of just being able to get to where you can get maybe in a wagon's trip of a day, you can send your crops on the Erie Canal, and suddenly you're dealing with a much larger market. So they're not only creating a national web of commerce, they're also creating an international web of commerce, because these canals and steamships go to international ports, which mean that you can now do business from the western part of New York with people who live in London. And the other thing that increases here is the pace of business, right? So instead of having to negotiate a business deal through a series of letters, which might take you many weeks, now you can negotiate a business deal by the telegraph, and it's only going to take you a couple of days. Likewise, it might have taken you weeks to send your logs, for example, down the Mississippi River. Now you have them in a steamship, and it takes just a couple of days. So there's an overall expansion in the number of people who can participate in markets, the expansion of the distance at which you can participate in a market, and the pace at which you can do it. You can do business much faster with these revolutions in transportation and communication. And in the next video, I'll talk more about how these transformations in technology and the scope and pace of American business affected the society of the United States in the early 19th century. So why do we care about the market revolution? The Industrial Revolution and the transportation and communication revolutions of the early 19th century had a major impact on American society, both in the short term and in the long term. In this video, I want to talk about three major effects of the market revolution, and those were changes in labor, entry into a national and international market system, and the Second Great Awakening. All right, so what effect did the market revolution have on labor? Well, we've already talked about this a little bit in the earlier videos, but here's a view of a textile factory floor. Now, this is from a slightly later period, but I think it gives you a good sense of what it was like to work in a textile factory. With the market revolution really comes the emergence of factory labor in the United States. And there are a couple of ways that that's important. One is that people start working for wages. It's a move away from subsistence farming and a barter economy, which also means that people aren't necessarily in charge of themselves anymore. And there's a lot that goes along with that, which means that people stop being their own bosses. Instead, they report to other bosses. And that can be problematic because it means that you have a lot less control over your daily life. So imagine that you're a farmer and you're really sick. Oh, well, maybe you don't plant some seed that day and you do it the next day. Well, imagine that you work at a textile mill and you get really sick, you don't report to work, and you get fired. So people are no longer able to set the pace of their own lives, by and large. And with things like interchangeable parts, for example, fewer and fewer artisans, so masters of a craft, are making goods from start to finish. So it used to be perhaps you would be a master shoemaker, a master cobbler, and you would make every part of that shoe, from tanning the leather to nailing in the sole. The system of interchangeable parts, which will later become even more codified as the assembly line system, means that most people are only doing one part of a task. So instead of doing all of making a shoe and saying at the end of it, I made this shoe, I'm a master maker of shoes. Now your entire job might just be to hammer in one nail and then hand off the shoe to the next person. So there's never anything that you can point to and say, I made that. So a lot of people say that this is a period when people stop being able to take pride in their own work, or at least not as much pride. But what's even more important about this process of interchangeable parts, assembly line labor, is that it leads to an overall, what they call de-skilling. So removing the skill from labor. And what's important about that is that if you've broken down a task into enough small parts that you've got people literally hammering in the same nail on a different shoe 12 hours a day, then you don't necessarily need highly trained artisans to do that. And what happens if you are not highly trained? I would call this unskilled labor, and you decide you want to strike for higher pay. Well, your boss doesn't need to train anyone to hammer in that nail, so you just get fired. So it makes the labor force in general a little bit more precarious because you don't need an exceptional skill to have a factory job, but you are easily replaced. All right, let's talk about entry into a market system. Now, what do I mean by this? In this time period, the United States develops what's called a market economy. And that's different from what most people had been doing up until that point because people in the United States had mainly shipped raw materials over to Europe, England particularly, to be processed and made into finished goods. And this is similar to the system of mercantilism that you might be familiar with from the colonial era. Well, the War of 1812 and some of the conflict leading up to it led the United States to embargo England, which was a manufacturing center. So people couldn't send their raw materials there. They responded by investing in their own factories. So the War of 1812 is actually a pretty important moment for the development of domestic industrialization at home. And so now, instead of this kind of import-export or barter economy, people are making deals with other investors all over the United States, all over the world. So this gives people an opportunity to invest and to speculate. And that means that as they're part of an international market of investment, speculation, they're prone to the kinds of booms and busts that characterize capitalism, right? We often think of the Great Depression as having been the first major American depression, but really it was the largest and most recent up until that point because after the War of 1812, the United States kind of goes through approximately a 20-year cycle of boom and bust. So boom is when things are getting better, things are looking up, the economy is going really well, and then a bubble of some kind bursts. And in 1819, they had the very first of these bubbles burst. It's called the Panic of 1819. In land speculation. And this is the first time that the United States had actually experienced any kind of economic depression. So imagine how frightening that would have been to them. One of the hardest things about market-based capitalism is that individuals don't really have control over the larger market. You know, it's not one person that made the Great Depression happen. It was an overall loss in consumer confidence or perhaps overproduction, right? If too many people are supplying the same commodity, the price is dropping through the laws of supply and demand. So now the laws of supply and demand and the pressures of an international market are really changing the nature of American commerce because they're enmeshed in that market. And that has all kinds of political and social ramifications for the United States. You know, understanding the volatility of belonging to an international market kind of helps explain why Andrew Jackson was so obsessed with the national bank at this time period, right? Because it represents this confusing matrix of international supply and demand and people getting credit or not getting credit. And being part of this international market is something that's going to have a major effect on the American South, and particularly the enslaved population that lives in the American South, because they're going to be supplying cotton to the world's textile mills. And those are textile mills in New England and textile mills in England. And as the world demands cotton for processing, the South is going to supply that cotton, which is picked by enslaved individuals. And one of the reasons that the Confederacy believes that it can succeed as an independent nation is because they're supplying cotton to England. And when England managed to find its own supply of cotton from Egypt and India, the economic chances of the Confederacy were sunk. And the last thing that I think is related to this market revolution is the Second Great Awakening. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail about this because I have a whole separate series of videos about the Second Great Awakening, but this Second Great Awakening was kind of an explosion of religious fervor, which was happening at almost exactly the same time as the market revolution. And many American historians actually think that it's these confusing and confounding and anxious forces that lead a lot of people to take up religion, because as the world is changing around them, as people now have to relate in different ways to their neighbors as bosses and employees rather than bartering partners, and as they're swept up in international markets that are outside their control, people look for new explanations and comfort in an increasingly confusing world. So that's one explanation for the Second Great Awakening. So I started out this series of videos by saying that some historians have argued that the market revolution was actually more revolutionary than the American Revolution. Now, that's a difficult question to answer because we're talking about a revolution in politics as opposed to kind of a revolution of economics. But I will say that though the American Revolution dissolved the political bonds between the United States and Great Britain, its social and economic impact were relatively limited. Most people kind of ended up in the same place socially after the American Revolution as they were before it. But the market revolution changes an awful lot in American society in terms of how they participate internationally and how people organize their daily lives. So I think there is a strong argument to be made that this revolution of economics, technology, even religion is considerably farther reaching than the American Revolution. When we talk about the big social movements of the early 19th century in the United States, you can't deny that the emergence of Jacksonian democracy is one of the most influential aspects of early 19th century culture. So what was Jacksonian democracy, and why do we care so much about it? Well, I want to make the argument to you that Jacksonian democracy was really the birth of modern American political culture. And by that, I mean that during this time, lots of practices emerged that are still with us today. For example, the two-party system, the spoils system, even some aspects of American political character that are still with us today emerged in this time period. And by that, I mean the kinds of traits that we like to see in our politicians to consider them electable. So in this series on Jacksonian democracy, I'm going to take you on a journey from the earlier American political culture, some of the major changes that came about in the Jacksonian period, and then just discuss some of the ways that this still influences us today. All right, so if Jacksonian democracy was a new thing, what came before it? Well, in the very early
era of American political life, and I'm talking here from approximately 1790 to about 1820, American politics was very aristocratic. There were a couple of families that tended to dominate politics. The Adams family, for example, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. And these men were kind of considered to be maybe a higher character of man. They were the quintessential citizens of a republic. And along with that came, a certain amount of wealth and status and education. In between George Washington and Andrew Jackson, every single person who served as president had a college degree. Many of them were Virginians, and particularly Virginian planters. You see a lot of Virginians and a lot of people from Massachusetts in the first couple of years of the Republic. And many of them kind of shared a concern that there could be too much democracy, shall we say. That even though the United States was a democracy, many of the founders of the United States worried about the tyranny of the majority, the tyranny of the mob. That they had set up this democratic experiment where many people could vote, but they were afraid of having just too many people voting because they looked down on lower classes of society in that time period. They worried that if you didn't have a stake in the country, usually shown by property ownership, either in terms of land or in terms of wealth, then you wouldn't have the proper investment in the fate of the nation in order to make a rational decision about what sort of policies should be enacted. So in the early years of the United States, many states had voting laws that restricted the franchise to just propertied men. So really a quite small proportion of the overall populace of the United States could vote. Interestingly, this actually meant that in some northern states, both free people of color, free black men, and women could vote because they met the requirements for property ownership. But in the early 1800s, 1810s, these ideals of democracy began to catch on more and more among the common people. And as new states joined the Union, like Ohio and Illinois, they came in with state constitutions saying that all white male citizens could vote, regardless of whether or not they owned property or they paid taxes. So in this time period, white male citizenship became associated with voting, and some of the other states began to rewrite their state constitutions to grant the vote to all white males. And it probably won't surprise you that when they rewrote those laws, they managed to take out that little loophole for free people of color and women with certain amounts of property. So by the end of this period, in the 1850s, all property requirements for voting had been eliminated, and any white male above the age of 21 in the United States had the right to vote. And we'll get to what that meant for American politics in the next video. So we've been talking about the emergence of Jacksonian democracy in the first half of the 19th century in the United States. And we've been talking about how in this time period, the vote was slowly extended to all white male citizens, so that by the end of this period, there were no more property requirements in the United States, and any white male citizen could vote. Now, those property requirements had allowed free people of color and women to vote in some states, and when voting became associated with white male citizens, those little loopholes ended up getting closed. But this expansion of voting rights to all white male citizens
really represents a shift in how the average American thought about who deserved to have a voice in the political process of the United States. They stopped placing so much value on the sort of aristocratic Republican citizenship of the early days of the United States, where someone like George Washington would never run for office. He would stand for office. You wouldn't promote yourself. That would be vulgar. Instead, you would have men of well-known character promote you. But by the 1820s, very few Americans believed in the idea that there could be such a thing as too much democracy, that you would have to avoid the mob rule. Instead, they wanted the mob rule. They wanted a great expansion of democracy, and that was to them the real character of the United States. Now, I should also mention that this expansion of democracy was part of a larger international expansion of democracy. Similar laws that eliminated property restrictions on voting were also being passed in England and France at this time period. So there's kind of an international wave to broaden the franchise. But the extension of voting in Europe is nothing like the extension of voting in the United States. There are nearly twice as many eligible voters in the United States in the 1830s as there are in Britain, with a population that's half the size. So while European nations are taking small steps toward expanding the franchise, the United States is taking huge steps in this time period. So the first election where we start to see the influence of this new wave of voters is in the election of 1824. And let me give us a little bit more space to talk about this. So the election of 1824 was a contest between John Quincy Adams, son of American founder John Adams, Andrew Jackson, famous war hero from the War of 1812, the victor of the Battle of New Orleans, and Henry Clay, who will become known as the Great Compromiser for having pretty much spent his entire political career either running for president or putting together some kind of compromise. Now, John Quincy Adams, I think, kind of epitomized the older school of American democracy. He was reticent to campaign on his own behalf. He was very interested in academics and internal improvements. He didn't really see himself as being part of a particular political party. In fact, all three of these men were actually running as Republicans, because in the era of good feelings, there's only the Republican Party. So you can see how confusing this might have been as a voter to have three different candidates from the same party, and they're supposed to be different than each other. So in this election, Andrew Jackson wins the popular vote, and John Quincy Adams wins the electoral vote. And Henry Clay wins neither. Now, in a situation like this, who got to be president was decided by the House of Representatives. Well, guess who was Speaker of the House? Henry Clay. So he's out of the running himself, but he is in a position to make quite an impact on who wins the presidency. Well, John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay didn't have a whole lot in common, but they sure both hated Andrew Jackson. So Clay and Adams meet, and Henry Clay says, "Yeah, John Q, I'll see if I can get the House to vote for you." And that's what happens. So the House elects John Quincy Adams president. And then, just a couple days later, John Quincy Adams says that Henry Clay will get to be his Secretary of State, which was quite a plum of a political position. And Andrew Jackson and his supporters go ballistic. They say that this was a corrupt bargain behind closed doors, in which John Quincy Adams bribed Henry Clay to give him the presidency in exchange for this political position. Now, there's no evidence that this actual corrupt bargain really happened, but even if it did, it was totally in line with the earlier playbook of American democracy, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of situation, where the better sort of men, the higher men of character, made a deal between themselves
choice of who would lead this nation. And the outrage over this possible collusion between Adams and Clay really signaled that the old days of a couple of people making decisions about American politics were over, that this kind of deal between statesmen was now seen as undemocratic or crooked or something that was done behind closed doors and that was against the American character. And Andrew Jackson is really going to ride his wave of popular discontent over someone winning the popular vote but losing the electoral vote due to, in his mind, a corrupt bargain right into the presidency in the election of 1828. And we'll get to that in the next video. All right, in the last video, we talked about the election of 1824, which turned into a grudge match between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, in which Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, but John Quincy Adams won the electoral vote, and the tiebreaker turned out to be Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, who helped give the election to Adams, but then was shortly named Secretary of State by Adams, leading Andrew Jackson and his partisans to claim that a corrupt bargain had taken place. And this really shows how the nature of American politics had changed, because this sort of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours was common practice in American politics between a few elite men who were generally in charge of the political process. But Andrew Jackson and his supporters say that this is undemocratic. This is the kind of elitist hokum that we do not need in our nation of free white men. So 4 years later, in the election of 1828, it is a Jackson-John Quincy Adams rematch, and the gloves are off. So in the first video in this series, I mentioned that during this time period, a lot of the aspects that we consider part of American politics first came to the fore. And one of the things that you'll see in the election of 1828, really for the first time, is down and dirty mudslinging, or making angry attacks ad hominem, or at the man rather than at his principles, attacks on your opponent. So Andrew Jackson probably already had all the ammunition he needed with the corrupt bargain of 1824. John Quincy Adams kind of considered himself above this kind of mudslinging, but his supporters did not, and they came out with some real gems. Not only did they put out handbills with coffins, this is known as the coffin handbill to this day, detailing how many men had been killed by Andrew Jackson, either through execution or duels. They also accused his mother of being a prostitute and his wife of being a bigamist. In fact, Andrew Jackson's wife died shortly before his inauguration, and he believed to his dying day that it was the terrible slanders about her that had led to her untimely death. Another first for the election of 1828 is Andrew Jackson as the first candidate for the Democratic Party. This is a new party united around Jackson. In the previous election, all of the candidates had been Republicans in one form or another, but now the Republican Party is going to start to fade away, and the Democratic Party will come to the fore. And this is the same Democratic Party that is still in existence in the United States today. Of course, its goals and ideas have changed a great deal since the 1820s. And with this Democratic Party, and even with the supporters of John Quincy Adams, what Jackson taps into is this kind of mass party democracy. He has great party machines working for him in eastern cities. He also really takes advantage, particularly of people on the frontier. So white people who are looking to expand westward, to kind of make it, as we would say, rugged individuals, people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. And they saw that in Andrew Jackson because, he had been born fairly penniless, and then by the time he was elected president in 1828, he'd become part of the frontier elite. He was now a slaveholder. He was one of the guys who had made it. But those on the frontier looked to him and saw the example of what they wanted to be. Jackson also had the advantage of being a war hero.
from the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. And throughout the 19th century, those with valorous military service will do well in national elections. And another thing that Andrew Jackson does quite well is harnesses anti-Indian, anti-Native American sentiment. John Quincy Adams had attempted to bargain in good faith to try to hold up the side of the United States with Native American nations living in what was then the territorial borders of the United States. He bargained with them as if they were sovereign nations unto themselves. Andrew Jackson understood that white settlers desperately wanted Indian lands, and he played to those white settlers, assuring them that he would do his utmost to remove Native Americans from those lands, a promise that he will make good on during his presidency. So Jackson wins the election of 1828. And immediately it's obvious that the democracy under Jackson is quite different from the American system under previous presidents. At his inauguration, he turns to the crowd and bows, signaling that he thinks of himself as being beneath the people that he's serving. He also opens up the White House during what's called the inaugural brawl, and it's believed that many people went into the White House and they wrecked the china and they destroyed the furniture and they wouldn't leave until people told them there was alcohol outside on the lawn. And to an earlier generation who had been raised with this early American aristocracy of the Adamses and the Washingtons, this looked like anarchy. They thought this was the beginning of the French Revolution in the United States. It was not, but it was the beginning of massive party politics, political campaigns, and the beginning of a new politics in the United States that appealed to the common man. And we'll talk more about that in the next video. So we've been talking about Jacksonian democracy, and when we last left off, Andrew Jackson had defeated John Quincy Adams in the election of 1828, largely by claiming that Quincy Adams had won the previous election through a corrupt bargain. So Jackson played upon the sympathies of the public by claiming that he was the common man, or the representation of the common man. He took advantage of the growing number of white male voters who could participate in elections, and particularly the growing numbers of frontier settlers who not only wanted to vote for the first president to be born in the West, also supported Jackson because he was known for his anti-Native American sentiment and his promise to remove Native Americans from lands that whites wanted to settle east of the Mississippi. So in the first video in this series, I mentioned that most scholars point to this moment of Jackson's election in 1828 as the beginning of modern democracy. So let's investigate some of those claims a little bit further. So what was it about Jackson's election and presidency that began the modern American political system? Well, for one thing, Jackson was the very first Democratic president, as in the first president to be a modern-day Democrat. And this is the same Democratic Party that we still have today. And Jackson really mobilized this sentiment of the party of the common man. And in his idea, that meant the common white man. That he was not one of these Eastern elites, banking elites, who made their fortunes by nickel and diming other people. He was a backwoods frontiersman, a war hero, someone who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps. So he was, I guess, one of the earliest self-made men. And it was clear from the get-go that the age of Jackson was going to be a completely different kind of political culture than had existed previously, because at his inauguration, He had a giant inaugural celebration. He opened up the White House to anybody. The rabble came in and they trashed the place. And the older aristocratic class of Washington politicians thought that this was more or less the end of the republic as they knew it. This was going to be the era of mob rule. But, the wheels didn't come off democracy. And one thing that Jackson really did was he rewarded his supporters. He rewarded the people who had voted Democrat, who saw themselves as part of the Democratic Party, with government positions. And this is called the spoils system, along the lines of, to the victor go the spoils. So, to reward the Democratic machine that had put him in office, he kicked out earlier office holders and rewarded the Democrats with offices. Now, it was very common in this time period for people to be what were known as office seekers, to kind of hang out in Washington, D.C., trying to get the president to appoint you postmaster of some random place so that you could draw a government salary. Now, earlier presidents would have thought something like rewarding an office seeker quite vulgar. John Quincy Adams, for example, refused to replace anyone who was actually doing a good job in their government post with someone who was one of his supporters. So you can debate whether or not this is actually a good thing to kick out people who are good at their job in favor of people who have supported you during the campaign. But what it does is it keeps people in the party. So it makes sure that even if the party loses, they know that they have put in their labor for the Democratic Party and later for the Whig and Republican Party. And so they're going to keep working to put their candidate in office so that they can reap some rewards. So this is one way in which Jackson kind of solidifies party politics, so that you stop just being a Jackson partisan, a Jefferson partisan, someone who follows a political candidate. And remember that earlier political candidates kind of stood as men of virtue, right? Now, the virtue is shifting from the men themselves to the party that they represent. And this party system was cemented by 1832, when Jackson was reelected, when they held a national nominating convention. This sounds very familiar to us today. And put out an official party platform. So what else did Jackson do that was really influential? Well, ironically, for someone billing himself as a man of the people, Jackson worked really hard to expand the power of the executive branch. So he wanted the presidency to be as powerful, if not more powerful, than the judicial branch or the legislative branch of the United States. So more powerful than the Supreme Court or Congress. There were two major instances where he shows his interest in becoming the most powerful part of the American government. One of these was in what's known as the Bank War, when Jackson attempted to kill the Bank of the United States, and he succeeded, because he thought that the National Bank was corrupt, that it benefited the elite, that it deserved more oversight from the federal government, some of which was true. And when Congress tried to recharter the National Bank, he vetoed the charter, basically saying that he felt that his vote was more important than the vote of Congress. And for this, a group of people who started to coalesce around their hatred for Jackson started calling him King Andrew I, because Jackson used the power of the veto all the time because he was trying to, in some ways, reduce the power of the federal government, which was one of the key tenets of the Democratic Party, but at the same time kind of increase his own power because he used his veto in many cases to further his own agenda. And as much as the National Bank was not a great institution, it did help to keep the United States' economy more or less humming along. And once Jackson killed it, there was a major economic depression called the Panic of 1837, which we can lay pretty much squarely at Jackson's feet. You can see this political cartoon here has him trampling on the Constitution as he pushes his own agenda forward. And it's through their hatred of Jackson that a new group comes together, the Whig Party, which will provide the second half of the two-party system that comes to the fore in this time period. So this is Andrew Jackson arguing that the president has more power than Congress. There's a second example of Andrew Jackson trying to argue that he had more power than the Supreme Court, which comes in the Trail of Tears. So Andrew Jackson represented the interests of white settlers who really saw Native Americans as no more than an obstacle to their continuous push westward, the availability of land, which they saw really as the cornerstone of American prosperity. And I can't do justice to the entire Trail of Tears here. We have an article about that, and there'll be more to come in the future. But suffice it to say that the American Indians who were living in Georgia particularly, and who were known as the 5 civilized tribes, because they had adopted many of the ways of Europeans, including Christianity and in some cases slavery, the Supreme Court ruled that they were entitled to be treated as a sovereign nation. And so when Georgia is trying to remove Native Americans from their lands in Georgia, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, rules in their favor. And Andrew Jackson was quoted as saying, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." So even though the Supreme Court defended the status of the Native Americans living in Georgia, east of the Mississippi in general, Andrew Jackson and the state of Georgia went ahead with forcing the 5 civilized tribes to move westward to Oklahoma, during which at least 3,000 people died. So Andrew Jackson serves a second term and finishes out his presidency in 1836. He considered running for a third term, decided against it. Instead, his crony Martin Van Buren, who's basically Andrew Jackson Jr., serves as president for 1 term. But due to the Panic of 1837, Martin Van Buren, like poor Herbert Hoover later, is forced to deal with an economic depression, and you know that people are never happy with the incumbent president when there's an economic decline. So, in the election of 1840, the Whigs, the opposition party to Andrew Jackson, run William Henry Harrison as their candidate. And he is mostly famous for being a fellow who died in office after only 40 days. But what's interesting about William Henry Harrison's campaign is that the Whigs have learned their lesson about the political climate of the Jacksonian age. They marketed William Henry Harrison as having been born in a log cabin, a war hero. He was a man of the people, just a common guy who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps. Now, none of this was true. William Henry Harrison was from Virginia. He was from a very wealthy family. He had been college educated. He was no more rough and tumble than John Quincy Adams had been. But the Whigs had learned a valuable lesson about what American political culture was like in the age of mass democracy. And from this point forward,
It's clear that Americans don't like their politicians too highfalutin, and woe betide any candidate who wasn't born in a log cabin. The modern American political system had begun.